This presentation follows the development of men's fashions in the Neoclassical era. Men's garments became simpler in outward appearance during this time. During the 18th century, the full-skirted man's coat lost its fullness. At first, men started pinning the fullness of their skirts back to form a modified tailcoat shape. By 1789, the coat skirts were completely gone, leaving only a tail in the back. The major influence on men's fashion is riding clothing, or the riding habit. This is an important moment in fashion history when sporting clothes entered the dining room. The man on the left is shown wearing riding clothing. He sits on his saddle and holds a riding crop. He wears breeches that are tan, made of leather. The shape of the hat is also a riding hat, the tall crown meant to protect the head from overhead branches. The major influence on men's fashion is riding clothing, or the riding habit. This is an important moment in fashion history when sporting clothes entered the dining room. The man on the left is shown wearing riding clothing. He sits on his saddle and holds a riding crop. He wears breeches that are tan, made of leather. The shape of the hat is also a riding hat. The tall crown is meant to protect the head from overhead branches. The first ideal silhouette fits the body closely. The shoulders, waist, and hips are all about the same size. Whenever we see these slender styles in costume history, they favor young people, an interesting statement about what a society finds important. If a man did not have this ideal body, the clothing did not sit this smoothly on their figures. These first tailcoats did not close on the chest, and the vest sat at the top of the hips, adding to the illusion of the straight figure. Men continue to wear the three-piece suit from the 18th century. By the first few years of the 1800s, the coats will close in front with either single or double-breasted buttons. The three pieces did not match, but were carefully put together in pleasing combinations. In this case, you can't see the waistcoat, but it was always worn. Men did not leave their homes without all three pieces. The waistcoat would be visible if a man sat down or opened the top of his coat. During these early years, both knee breeches and pantaloons were worn. Pantaloons were full-length trousers. Here you can see a close-up of the bottom of one style of pantaloons. When they fit tightly to the leg, they split at the ankle to allow the foot to pass through when dressing. Some also featured a strap under the foot to keep them in place. Silhouette number 2 shows a slightly rounder and looser look instead of the tight body fit. In 1814, the Tsar of Russia visited London with an entourage of Cossacks as his bodyguards. Their full trousers caused a sensation, and men adopted those trousers that were fuller at the hips and not quite as tight to the leg. The vest is now shorter, ending at the high natural waist. These are examples of the signature neoclassical look for men. They wear three-piece suits with either knee breeches or pantaloons. We see both slipper shoes and boots. The boot style is called Hessian boots. The heart-shaped top is the distinctive feature. The lapel of the tailcoat shows two distinctive features as hallmarks of this era. The first is a cut in the lapel that makes an M shape. There is also a tall stand at the back of the neck, causing the suit to look like a steep slope from the head to the chest. The collar and lapel roll over to create a rounded shape. Compare this to the suit collar and lapels that we wear today that lay flat on the body. It's important to note that trousers kept the fall front opening from the 18th century breeches. We have not yet invented the front fly closure. This is a particularly conspicuous version, which is why I am showing it to you. During this era, the closures will become more discreet. The most important arbiter of taste during this time in London was a man named Beau Brummel, best friend to the Prince Regent. It is significant that he was not an aristocrat, and he set the new rules how gentlemen dress using more middle-class values. He rejected the showy fabrics, bright colors, and wigs. He promoted plain, fine-quality fabrics instead of decoration, subtle colors, and patronizing the right tailor. This is a middle-class ideal, that inconspicuous propriety or understated elegance is the ideal for men. That is never how aristocrats thought, who sought to impress with their showy fashions. This propriety influences what men wear even to this day. So the next time you wear a suit, you are walking in Beau Brummel's footsteps. Men wore underdrawers and shirts as their main underwear. Shirts could be fuller like the 18th century, but they begin to shrink in the arms to fit under tight jacket sleeves. Note the very tall collars that stood straight up. Another hallmark of a gentleman was wearing this white collar and filling in the neckline with fancy ruffles and bows. This ideal neckwear is 4 elements put together. The first is the shirt collar, as you can see on the left. In its most fashionable ideal, it raises tall enough to hide the jawline. The second is the ruffles you see on the top of the chest. Those are sewn to the shirt. The third is a neck wrapper called a stock. These covered most of the shirt collar, leaving just the collar points visible. Stocks could be soft or hard, pleated or plain, black or white, made of cloth or sometimes even leather. The fourth element is a neckcloth or a cravat, which tied over the stock. How you tied it was considered part of a man's self-expression. There were styles named for different versions. This is another influence from Beau Brummel. A gentleman could spend a lot of time tying the perfect style that expressed his personality. Instead of wearing aristocratic fabrics, it is subtle individual touches like this one that distinguish the gentleman now. Note the example in the center is a pre-made stock with a cravat attached. It is now important to make sure everything stays neatly in place, so you don't look like you actually spent any effort on dressing. Again, this is opposite of the aristocratic ideal of fashion. Before this time, the more effort it took to dress, and the more people you had helping you, the more obvious your status and power. Now, effortlessness becomes part of elegance, a standard that is still held true today. The next time you compliment someone on an outfit and they say, "What, this old thing?" they are following rules set during the Neoclassical era. Men developed a more comfortable way to dress at home in the morning or in the evening. The banyan or dressing gown from the 18th century loses its baggy Turkish shape and becomes more tailored during this era. This particular dressing gown is also an interesting example of early printing technology. The desire for printed fabrics will grow during this era as we have more exposure to India, where we will learn fabric printing. In France, we will see the rise of an influential fashion subculture called the Incroyable, or the Incredibles. They protested the reign of terror and the extreme authoritarian government after the fall of aristocratic rule. Their fashions were the grunge movement of their time, featuring wrinkled and baggy coats, and you can see huge lapels. They wore wild hair and extreme cravats wrapped around the neck like scarves. They preferred pale skin called a prison pallor in sympathy with those who'd been sent to jail. Their jackets grew to be wider at the shoulders and smaller in the waist, or featuring a long skirt. The fashion plate on the left is an interesting example of one of the first umbrellas being recorded. The umbrella did not enter European fashion until a large boost in Japanese trade goods occurred at just about this time. We also have cartoons from this time showing incroyable using corsets to create their extreme figure shapes. There's no way to know if this was common, but we do have evidence a small percentage of men have used corsetry since the 18th century, especially to maintain an upright posture. The women of this subculture were called mères velours. They scandalized Paris with extremely wrinkled, diaphanous dresses in fabrics so thin they were nearly see-through. They too wore wild hair and especially low-cut necklines. This period begins the tradition of formulaic formal wear for men. Prior to this, wealthy men wore suits of fabrics such as velvet and satin with embroidery and trim and lace on their shirts. The tailcoat will now become the only item acceptable for formal wear. The rule for black and white has not been invented quite yet, so we will see jewel tones such as dark green, dark maroon, blue, gold, black, and brown. There are two styles of hats important to this period. The first is the bicorn that we now associate with Napoleon and military officers of the period. The figure on the right is wearing an outdoor coat called a redingote or caped coat, a derivation of the word riding coat. Its distinguishing feature is the cape on the shoulders. He also wears the second important hat, the steeple hat, named after the steeplechase in horseback riding, where horse and rider jump over fences and ditches. This is another example of how menswear was defined by sports clothes. During this era, the hat dips low over the face and neck in back, and the brim curls up at the sides. Men wore their hair in a revival of classical Greek and Roman styles brushed forward onto their face. This style is called Titus hair after the Roman general. Curly hair was the ideal. Men's accessories included rings and watches. The watches were worn on chains that hung from the waist or were tucked into pockets. Men used decorative charms called fobs on the end of the chain. This etching of kitchen workers shows the working classes dressed in a mixture of old styles and new, garments adopted from the 18th century and the new styles. Their coats are short and shapeless, as seen on the man seated in the left-hand corner. There are no tails on the coats. The man in black has a coat that appears to be an 18th century coat cut just below the pockets, perhaps a repurposed garment. There's a mixture of colored shirts and more casual neck cravats. This style will continue for working men through the first half of the 19th century. During the Neoclassical era, men established the rules that will govern their wardrobes for over 200 years. These rules created a simplicity in outward appearance, tailored clothing derived from riding clothing, darker colors, the emphasis on white shirts and neckwear. But fashion created a paradox. This simplicity was matched with increasing complexity in cut and sewn tailoring. Only the wealthy could afford a master tailor to create these garments perfectly. Compare our wealthy man on the left to the working men on the right, whose clothes allow more comfort and movement. Fashion historians also consider the discomfort men went through with the high collars, stocks, and cravats that confine the neck and interfere with turning the head. Between the tailoring and the neckwear, men had to stand and sit in prescribed ways. All this perfect white fabric had to be laundered and starched and pressed by servants. And a gentleman would need help from a servant to dress in this style of neckwear. Only someone who doesn't work for a living could wear this style of clothing. The contrast becomes stark when we compare this to peasant workers who do need to move more freely. The white fabric and the collar is indeed a sign of privilege. We will close this presentation with a quote from Beau Brummel that sums up this era for menswear. To be truly elegant, one should not be noticed. But of course, it cost quite a lot of money to be correctly unnoticeable.